Welcome back to our series. This is our story. This is our song. I'm so excited to introduce our special guest for today, Mr. Brad Bickhart. Mr. Bickhart is a new and upcoming tenor who is known for his healthy and soaring tenor voice. He earned his Bachelor of Music in Voice at Indiana University in 2018, and he went on to earn his Master's in Voice at Indiana University in 2020. Just to name a few of his performances, he performed in Indiana University's production of La Traviata as Alfredo in 2020, Opera Naples production of West Side Story as Big Deal and Diesel, and finally, he performed in Opera Ithaca's production of Le Nozze di Figaro as Basilio and Curzio in 2022. So without further ado, here is Mr. Bickhart. Thank you, Mr. Bickhart. Thank you for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
So my first question for you is, what was your experience like landing your first role in a professional opera company, especially since it was during the midst of COVID?
Yeah, so actually my first professional gig actually happened back in 2016. Um, and that was a production of South Pacific. And I'm happy to talk about that, or would you rather sort of go into working through like the height of COVID?
Yeah, we can definitely talk about that. I would love to hear more. And then we can kind of go into what your experience was like during COVID.
Yeah, I believe I was a sophomore in undergrad at Indiana University, and at that point, that was kind of the start of companies sort of posting all of their applications online. So before then, a lot of times like your teachers or either voice teachers or professors would get audition listings from companies directly. And so that's how I found out about this casting opportunity at Charlottesville Opera. And I just submitted for it because um, I've been fortunate enough to do both musical theater and opera throughout my career. And I didn't really know anything about auditioning. So at that point, it was still kind of just send in recordings and you may hear back, you may not. I just submitted, I just recorded a musical theater song and an opera aria that I was working on at the time, and just was fortunate enough to be cast in that production. So that was, yeah, it was about 2016, and then um, you know 4 or 5 or so years later, it's 2020 and we're dealing with COVID, and I had just finished up my master's in
Mm.
2020, and so I was part of that first group that we had spring break that went on forever, uh, and so for the next sort of 6 months or so, that was when, yeah, everything was completely shut down. But the Opera Naples in Florida, they were able to sort of do semi-staged concert versions of Traviata and West Side Story, and so I believe someone on their casting department had heard me um, at school beforehand. But so long story short, basically was able to submit for that, and I was fortunate enough to get sort of um, gigs that were happening outside. A lot of companies did that, and still
Mm.
are kind of doing that too, moving to either concerts outside or semi-staged productions outside. So I'm kind of definitely very fortunate that I was didn't really have a huge interruption
Right.
um, during COVID, even though the industry looked vastly different.
So, my next question for you is, how did you get into an operatic career? And when was the first time that you thought opera could be a potential career path for you?
Yeah, so I music was always a part of my life, even as a kid. But I growing up, I was more of a soccer, basketball person than I
Oh.
was a performer. And I played trumpet since I was like 5 or so, and I played trumpet all through elementary school and high school. But when I was a junior, I think in high school, sophomore, junior, I did really bad knee injury, and so I was out of sports for like a whole year. And I was in choir just as a class because I was like, wow,
Hmm.
it's easy. I, during the time, in which I couldn't do anything because of my knee, I went to my choir teacher, and I had just, what was the musical that I'd seen? I think it was Les Mis. It may not have been Les Mis, but that's Les Mis is a
Right.
good answer
I
to
love
say.
Les Mis.
Yeah, we're gonna assume it was Les Mis. It was definitely either Les Mis or Sweeney Todd. Um, and I kind of told her, I was like, so I can sing in the shower sometimes, but I've never really tried singing. And she was like,
Mm.
no, I know. She's like, I know that you're just sitting there in choir, mouthing the words, not doing anything. Um, and so I was like, well, I would love to, like, I'm just curious, like, can I try to sing for you? And is it good? And so I did, and she was like, okay, sure. What do you want to sing? And I was like, that song "Bring 'Em Home" sounds really easy. And so we did that, and she was like, all right, why don't you try, don't try just breathing as largely as you can. There's this muscle called the diaphragm and whatnot. And so as
Right.
many of our very first voice lessons, I'm sure have happened. But long story short, I kind of was then at a crossroads between, do I want to study musical theater, and then she was saying, you can pursue opera. And I was like, all right, well, I don't really know any operas. I was like, I, I know my grandma listened to some dude named Robert Merrill. And so I actually took a voice lesson with a family friend who she routinely sings principal roles at the Met and around the world, and she showed me the famous 1990 Three Tenors concert,
Yes.
and I was just like, okay, I have to do this. I was like, it was, that was the sort of inspiration spark, um, in which I was just like, yeah, I get it. Like, I don't know what it is, but there's something about this music um, definitely is, speaking to me. I feel something doing this. And so I essentially learned, I think for undergrad, I don't know if it's still the same requirements, but it's like, you just learn 3 art songs basically. Um, and that was the entirety of my repertoire, was those
Mm.
3 songs that I needed for like pre-screening and auditions. And I was fortunate that um, Indiana University sort of took a chance on me, that I really didn't know anything even, about performing, um, much less opera and classical music at that time. So I did my undergrad there, and I stayed for my graduate degree as well, and was fortunate enough to just kind of keep going. And I've been working professionally now for the last 7 or 8 years. This is what's really really cool about it. It's not opera's not something where it's like, you need to have trained your entire life, and then that's the only way to do it. So
That's amazing. And I have a very similar story. I didn't know much about opera, and it wasn't until someone in my church said that I had a potential to sing classical music that I decided to delve more into opera as a career. And as I started taking voice lessons and taking that leap of faith, I really developed an appreciation for the art form. So your story is definitely inspiring. And kind of talk a little bit more about your upbringing. I know you talked a little bit about your grandmother, but were there any other family members that influenced who you are today?
I'm a Korean adoptee to a bunch of New Jersey Italians and Germans. And on the music side, my dad played. He was a brass player. He primarily played trumpet,
Mm.
and that's where I got that from. And then my mom has been a kindergarten teacher for 30 plus years, and
Wow.
so she plays piano and guitar. So I grew up, always around music. I just never sort of studied it, as a kid. I'd say that my parents are my biggest inspiration. and essentially, my biggest motivators and supporters as well. And um, and I was very fortunate too that like when I did kind of come home that day and I was like, yeah, so I had a voice lesson and I think I might want to study opera in college or vocal performance in college. I'm very fortunate that my family was incredibly supportive and they were kind of like, well, we trust that you'll put in the work to do this. So they were already, musically inclined and musically able to say, talent will get you in the audition room, but this
Mm-hmm.
is, you're preparing for a life of constantly working at something. And so those are still you know, even as I'm, getting close to almost a decade, being able to do this professionally, it's essential to sort of keep that same mentality and to keep those values and everything.
So, kind of going into having to constantly keep your name relevant and present in the operatic scene. To you, what is the relevance and importance of having underrepresented groups on stage in opera?
Um, there are specifically in opera in America. There are numerous stage practices that are not only outdated but just straight up offensive that have persisted in opera. Um, Specifically, we can touch on the use of blackface
Mm-hmm.
as well as yellowface. And there are not many houses that still practice that. But I know for a fact in America, as recently as 5 years ago, there were absolutely opera companies that were casting white actors playing Black, Asian, and Latinx roles, and then putting them in hair and makeup to make them appear to be that race. And that um, opera primarily has an older donor base, and so it has been a legitimate fight, especially in the last few years, um, to make sure that these traditionally offensive practices are sort of done with. More importantly, that audiences and sponsors and donors know the reason why. I'm fortunate to do some work with the Asian Opera Alliance, who also they work as well with the Black Opera Coalition, as well, just trying to because I think the big misconception is that when people say, we want casting and we want to see the faces that represent the communities on stage, people think that, oh, well, you just want to only cast a certain demographic. Specifically for in opera, we can talk about that there are specifically um, operas with Black characters and with Asian characters, and um, when the sort of a lot of the social climate was changing in the arts originally, this is before, like, even I was an adult yet.
Mm-hmm.
You would find, here is X soprano, here's X Black soprano, and this company is trying to, show that they're progressive, they're casting diversely, but now they're only going to be singing in Porgy and Bess. They're only going to be singing in Aida. Um, and same with a lot of Asian singers. They would be finally getting seen and represented, but they were only being cast in Madame Butterfly. They were only being casted in Turandot. Stories are, quite frankly, they're not rooted in reality. So even if you have these roles in operas that are, you may see them as being traditionally cast white. Very, very rarely um, is it ever essential to the character, to the narrative, and certainly to the music, for that character to be white. And I think that is something that there are a lot of companies that are genuinely making strides in that and in casting. Um, I don't remember who sort of coined this phrase and whatnot, but I really like thinking about it that way, in that you are casting to represent the faces in your community. And
Mm-hmm.
while the arts have been incredibly progressive in many things, um, racial diversity has not been one of them. But I am at least encouraged that um, there are many, many good people out there trying to um, trying to rectify that and reconcile that.
I agree with everything you said. And there needs to be a level of inventiveness when it comes to tailoring productions to represent a diverse group of people. Especially since, like you said, most of the patrons are old white people. And I think that's part of the reason why minority groups feel like they can't connect to the stories being told on stage, which is why I'm so passionate about bringing this project to life to share our stories and hopefully encourage more people to get in the seats.
You're right in what you just said, and that I think the more that, because it kind of works both ways, the more people who don't traditionally go to the theater or go to opera see people who look like us, see people not cast in this traditional white straight world, feel, well, this story is also being told, like, for me, this story is also being told for me. Um, and I think that's another thing too, is that you can look at changing demographics of opera goers, and actually the audiences are getting younger and younger.
Yes.
Um, and so the trend is that these uh, diverse, racial, cultural, and political, people being represented on stage are actually what audiences want to see. And I think
Mm-hmm.
that's something that this business, even if it's taken longer than it should, I think that is something that this business is starting to actually recognize, that it's not, you're not pandering, you're not pandering to not get canceled. It's, no, this is what your paying audience wants to see. They want to feel like their story is being told. They want to feel that they're being heard. They want to feel like they're being represented. So
Right.
it's encouraging and whatnot. And it's especially encouraging to, to see the work that you're doing with this project as well. So
Thank you. I appreciate that. So let's talk a little bit about what is your dream role in the future and why?
it's, I get asked that question a bit, and I'm fortunate enough to say that in a musical, at least, I've done my dream role already, because it was Tony in West Side Story. Actually, for a while, I was able to do my dream role in opera too, which was Nemorino in The Elixir of Love. And I've
Nice.
been fortunate enough to do that twice now. Um, so I think I'm gonna say, for a musical, it would probably be Quasimodo in The Hunchback of Notre Dame. Wise. I'm gonna say Cavaradossi in Tosca, and yeah, I think that's probably the number one dream role right now. But the Duke in Rigoletto is up there. Yeah, I think something in the actually Werther. Actually, I'm gonna scratch
Mm.
that because I forgot about Werther. I'm gonna say Werther.
And going off of that, did you start doing musical theater before you started doing opera? Or how did all of that take place?
So no, it was more of just I was into musical theater before I did opera, because I didn't start um, even performing until I was like a junior senior in high school. Before I went to Indiana to start um, college. But I think I've always been a fan of musical theater, and I've been fortunate that I've been able to kind of be one of the people that, like, when the opera companies do the musicals, I'll be there. I consider myself a crossover artist. I think a lot of performers in America now these days, even if it's not like a 50-50 split, familiar and able to kind of step into, especially like a lot of the golden age musicals. And um, but yeah, I would say I started more as a fan of musical theater, trained, sort of in classical music and classical voice. But as I got older and started getting more gigs, I was able to also just sort of be available to be cast in musical theater as well.
I definitely see the same trend happening where a lot of artists are doing both musical theater and opera, which is really cool to see because I personally started doing musical theater before I did opera. So it's just really neat to see this crossover between the two art forms happening. And I was also curious because On your resume, it says that you're proficient in bullwhip, hand-to-hand combat, and dagger. So can you talk a little bit about the physicality that goes into an opera production?
I had to take a Tylenol this morning because my back's been sore from a fight call that I was in yesterday for this new Frankenstein opera. There's a fight. My character fights the monster. But yeah, I'd say the more, yeah, I would absolutely agree with what you said that there is a lot more physicality. There's a lot, especially opera in America. Like you have to have this skill set beyond singing, and I would say that there are. I really can't think of productions, singers, directors, anything in which you would just be standing up there in a stage production, standing there and only singing. I think that is kind of a stereotype of opera, especially from the other disciplines in the arts. But
Hmm.
um, I cannot think of a single show that I've done in which I felt like it was just walk out, sing, turn around, and leave. It feels as active as musicals do. In stage combat, um, just any other. I mean, well, first you have to act. It's not acting in opera is no longer a special skill. It's a job requirement, and you might get away a little bit with it in some European houses, but for the most part, um, anything you can do in the other disciplines of theater, but especially in opera, like there's so many sword fights, there's so many people who die in opera. Like,
Yeah.
got to know how to do all that stuff safely.
And the dancing, too. There's been a lot of recent productions that have incorporated more diverse styles of dance into their productions. So you definitely have to be able to do a little bit of everything.
No, every opera singer needs to know how to waltz.
At some point in your career, you're going to waltz. I also wanted to ask you, if you could go back in time and speak to your 12-year-old self, what would you tell him?
Keep practicing piano and take dance lessons.
Yeah, I tell you, having dancing skills and having a background in dance is so important. And piano skills are essential to our profession because oftentimes we're singing by ourselves and we need to play the music and the chords as well as we are practicing. Also, if you could give one piece of advice to young people that are watching today, what would you tell them?
There are. It's not necessarily fair that we will have to think about our identity and how we're represented, and how we can't help but always think that that is a factor for our benefit or negatively in any casting decision or any decision of you getting a gig. But I would say, even though it is unfair and even though it is not how it's supposed to be, continuing to show up and essentially we will make them see.
Hmm.
We'll make them see that we'll make them see in the way we're prepared, in the way we're practicing, in the way that we're training in the other sort of elements that go into being a performer.
Right.
And just really like one of my mentors, Nina Yoshida Nelson, who's a Japanese American soprano, mezzo soprano. She recently had an interview with, I think, Time magazine, but she basically said, "I might be the first to do this role, and as someone who looks like me, but I definitely won't be the last." And I think that by the resilience of marginalized groups in this country, especially of years and certainly decades, and I think it's as difficult as it is, as unfair as it is, that you have to go in with that mindset. Um, I personally believe that is how we will be successful in being represented, in being seen, in being heard. Is that we will make them hear,
Hmm.
and you might be the first to do something, but make sure that you're not the last.
I agree with that completely. And once you get in that spot and get a seat at the table, bring as many people along with you. Mentor as many people as you can so that you have a line of people that are ready to fill your position when you can't fill that position anymore. And that way, a legacy continues at whatever production or opera company you were at. Well, I hate to say, but we are closing our interview. But before we go, can you share a little bit about your upcoming engagements and performances?
Sure. You can find my full schedule just on bradbickhart.com. But for the near future, a lot of my season will be with Arizona Opera. So if you just Google Arizona Opera, you can just go and click on their season, and my face should be there somewhere.
Awesome. Thank you so much.